The first lecture of this session was Eddie Karni that started his relations with David Schmeidler in the 1970s in the previous century. The second speaker is one that started his relations with David Schmeidler in the 80s of the previous century. And this is Professor Itzhak Gilboa, who was the first PhD student of David Schmeidler, completed his PhD in 1987. He is an Israeli economist and decision theorist with important contributions. He is a fellow of the Econometric Society and a fellow of the Society for the Advancements of Economic Theory, an honorary foreign member of the American National Academy of Sciences. He is a professor of economics in Tel Aviv and in HEC Paris. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There'll be a bit of an overlap between Adi's talk and mine, and this is because we took a cab here together. So according to what Israel taught us, if the posteriors are commonly known, they have to be equal. So we coordinated in a cab. But actually, it's going to be complementary. I'm going to just talk about this question of can uncertainty be quantified by probabilities, which is, I think, very interesting and deep philosophical question having to do with induction learning. It has obviously very interesting mathematical sides, but also very practical issues. So I'm not really talking about David. I've been working with David for 40 years. Actually, first course I took in decision theory was with Adi Karni. This was even before I met David. And then I think Adi went back to Chicago or something. And then when I had any questions about anything, I met David, and we started basically 40 years of working together on issues. For me, this is, if I have to say, what's been interesting to me in the past 40 years, I would say that's the question. And practically all of it was work with David. So I'll just tell you, what I think is his contribution the same way I put it in textbooks, the same way I teach it. It's not because this is an evening about David. It's just, for me, I think his contributions are at this level that you'd hear it from me even if it is not an evening about him. So the problem is whether any type of information, any type of ambiguity can be written down or assessed in probabilities. There is this notion of Knightian uncertainty, and Frank Knight, alongside Keynes, was one of the people who thought that it cannot. And then the question is, how do we deal with that if probability is not given to us by, say, games of cards or throwing dice or things like this where probabilities are well defined, and when we don't have statistics as in the case of insurance problem, like what's the probability of my car being stolen, but beyond this. And these things are quite relevant. I don't know, you're not supposed to see anything here. Now do I really know what's in there. So this is, I picked it up from a paper in 2014. They themselves picked it up from a paper in 2003. But basically, these are different estimations of global warming. You have here like 20-some different groups of scientists work on the question of how bad global warming is going to be. And what you have here are density functions. So on the x-axis, you would see basically temperatures. I think it's average over the entire globe, and then a density function that's supposed to say how likely these things to happen. The point is that they differ. Okay, they're all over the place. It may be exaggerated. All here are scientists who believe that there is such a thing as global warming. All of them would agree about some point, but there's still quite a bit of disagreement on the details. Something else, this is something that Massimo Marinacci and I wrote in sort of a survey paper, and we wanted to show that even scientists don't always agree on probabilities. So we picked up a couple of websites that give you the probability of a cardiovascular event in the next 10 years, depending on some parameters that you put in. So we invented these two types, John and Lisa, and you put in age and gender and some other like 5 things, and you get estimation of the risk. So John and Lisa here are different, whatever we put in terms of weight or whatever. Admittedly, we played around with this a little bit to get this kind of disagreement, but you do get a disagreement, so I don't have the details, but John would go from 25% to 50-some, Lisa similarly, and the point is that this is very scientific. This is as scientific as it gets, okay? So the previous slides I showed you were by groups of scientists who are trying to estimate global warming, and they try to divide, the atmospheres and the oceans to little blocks and try to run simulations. Each simulation is 3 to 4 months computer, supercomputer. This is by, Mayo Clinic, Harvard Medical School, lots of respectable places, and they differ. And the question is, what do we do when estimation of these probabilities differ? Because it's not about...
What are these percentages?
The chance that John would have a cardiovascular event over the next 10 years.
Over the next?
10 years. Okay?
At least also?
At least. No, this is over the, no, just over the next 10 years, at least one cardiovascular event. 10 years, 10 years. 10 years. But it depends. I don't know how old John was here. I mean, we played around with some parameters. So we plugged in, his cholesterol level and his, maybe John is a smoker. I mean, we shouldn't. No, I'm sorry. So John, the variance, I'm sorry. Yeah, I should have said, I'm sorry. Lisa and John are different types. So John, the probability for John having a cardiovascular event is somewhere between 25 and 53, according to the different websites. And for Lisa, it's between 11 and 27. The point is that we could look at something which is supposedly scientific, based on serious databases. Moshe Leshner here helped us understand what we're reading there in terms of what kind of analysis they do. It's sort of logic, not exactly, right? They use the Weibull distribution or something, so Moshe Leshner helped us find it. The point is that we can try to do very serious science in trying to estimate probabilities and still get variance in the answers. It's not that we have a scientific answer, a single answer as to what the probability of something happening, and these things are important because if we are talking about things like global warming or these cardiovascular events, they matter to important decisions. So, the accepted solution in the field of economics and finance, etc., is to use subjective probabilities, the Bayesian approach. Adi Karni talked a bit about it, but I'd like to go back a little bit and to pay tribute to Blaise Pascal. So, as Adi said, he's one of the founders of probability theory. There was one Cardano about 100 years before, but I think that Pascal gets the credit for probability and the notion of expectation. There were others at the same time. And then Blaise Pascal had a near accident, and he basically did much less probability, much less science, and much more philosophy. He wrote the Pensée, and he became much more interested in theology, and he suggested the wager. And the first famous wager, and I shouldn't get here, I have 12 minutes to talk, and usually when I start to talk about the wager, it takes something like 40 minutes because it's so exciting, The wager is Pascal trying to convince us that we should believe in God. And there are about 5 ideas that start from the idea of a decision matrix, the idea of a dominant strategy, the idea of expected utility, and subjective probability. Why it's here, for the sake of the argument, is that basically the argument says, even if you believe that God exists in a small probability, because the afterlife has infinite payoff for you, and what awaits you here on earth is finite, it's worth your while to bet on the existence of God. And he's also sensitive to the idea that you want to become a believer, that you don't just choose to believe, that you have to work on this. And by the way, he's not talking about hell, he's talking about heaven. And as Adi said, there is a question of why probability theory waited so long, and why didn't the Romans talk about it? Because we have evidence that they had gambling and they stopped, and the same kind of problems that Pascal invented expectation for already existed 2,000 years ago. They didn't do it. So part of it is that putting human at the center. Okay, so Pascal also, and there's an entire book written about the fact that he's telling you why you should believe in God, not why God exists. Because the sport was to prove that God exists out of nothing, and Pascal, who was a very devout believer himself, changes the question not to whether God exists out there, but why it's better for you to become a believer. So very Renaissance. Bayes, why is it called Bayes? Because Bayes tried to prove, this was a little bit later, so Bayes is, we usually cite 1763, I think it was after his death. So we cite this, the Bayesian approach, and Bayes said, well, try to prove that God existed. Okay, and he was a man of the cloth. And how do you prove that God existed? He said, well, we see the world that we, and this is based on the book by McRae, by the way. So we see the either God is or God is not, okay? And if I can, yeah, God is or God is not. If God is, the world as we see it has conditional probability of 1, because this is what's written in the scripture. If God is not, you need to start assuming all kind of, coincidences, to have life on the planet, to have this, to have that, lots of coincidences. And Bayes knew that probability of A given B is not like B given A, right? We know this today, we can play with this, and we have Kahneman-Tversky's experiment to show that people mix this up. But Bayes knew that in order to go from probability of the world given God to God given the world, you need a prior. And then he said, let's say 50-50, okay? And world, the wonderful world that we see around us with... the world with life and the DNA and the mysteries of the brain and all the kind of things that we find that we are in awe when we see. Okay, the kind of thing that we say. I mean, basically, Bayes' argument is exactly the intelligent design argument today. Okay, the same in the argument that says the watchmaker argument that says someone must have designed this. It can't be. Yeah, I mean, world, it means we observe the beauty of, what we see. Life on the planet, DNA, brain, human brain, all kind of things that make people think that this was designed by someone. Let's say no world is that we wouldn't be observing this. Now, we observe the world, we know that we are here, and the question, I mean, in philosophy, this is called the watchmaker argument or something. Given the fact that we see such a wonderful world, is it not likely that there is a designer, right? So this argument is apparently...
Is there a doubt about the existence of the world?
No. But so we condition on the world, and we have to go back to ask whether we are in this branch or that branch, and in order to do this trick, we need a prior.
Okay. If there were no God, there would be no world. Is that the idea?
No, the question is if I have a condition, I have a conditional probability in the second level, conditional probability of the world given God and conditional probability of the world given no God. Let's say this is an epsilon. And I want to revert it, okay? And I cannot just do it, and if I could do it, with maximum likelihood, but I think maximum likelihood is not sufficiently impressive. I think this is also the logic of miracles, why miracles are so impressive. You need to do something really impressive, like, change a cane to a snake or something really impressive, because maximum likelihood is too easy. Anyway, I need to move on. Time passed by, the 19th century has seen very little of subjective probabilities. Subjective probabilities sort of resurfaced in the early the 20th century. Bruno De Finetti, I think, is maybe the most adamant proponent of this approach and contributed a lot to Bayesian statistics. Even though to this day, most of what statistics is about, Bayesian statistics is only one part of statistical reasoning. It's not what we teach in the basic stuff. And just not too recently, I asked Yoav a question about whether we should do something Bayesian, and said, why Bayesian? Where would you get the prior from? So the problem with Bayesian, the subjective approach, is that it's very subjective. I don't have much time, so I'll skip this. I'll just say, you heard Adi, and basically what convinced people in our field that the subjective probabilities are the rational thing to do is this approach that started with Borel, Ramsey, and De Finetti, who basically, in the spirit of logical positivism, suggested that we define concepts by the way we use them. And that's the same way that we do utility in economics, the revealed preference paradigm. The idea here was the same with subjective probabilities. And the beautiful theorem by Jimmy Savage, and then there was contribution of Anscombe and Aumann, even though Aumann has had many exchanges with Savage about it. But basically, it's a very beautiful theorem that convinced the entire profession, economics, finance, political science, any field that uses probabilities, that the rational way to approach things is by subjective probabilities coupled with this idea of expected utility. Okay, David didn't find this convincing, okay? And I think here this is an important thing for me to say because David's contribution in decision theory were not along the classical lines, people often think of it as if, it's part of behavioral economics, or maybe he was influenced by Ellsberg and was trying to explain Ellsberg's experiment. But I think it's very important that it was not the case. He just felt something here didn't work. It didn't match his intuition, okay? And I think that this is why his contribution is so much deeper than many other things that we've seen in the, let's say, behavioral economics, because it was not out to explain an experiment. So as I said, yes, later on he found out that Ellsberg ran this experiment, but he just felt that it doesn't feel the same. One thing that I find very impressive about David here is that he was not blinded by the beauty of the theory, because Savage's theorem is really very beautiful. I really get excited every time I teach it, and I can't believe that I devoted my life to violations of this theorem, and that's what I tell the students, but it's still, it's very beautiful. And I personally would be one of those who would just be, fall in love with the beauty of the theory and just keep teaching it for the rest of my life. And David, though he was a mathematician and loved the mathematical beauty, felt that something here doesn't work well. He came with this intuition of saying, okay, suppose that I have two coins. One coin I pull out of my pocket. I tested it many times. I know it's 50-50. Then you pull out a coin out of your pocket. I don't know what, and I don't know anything about it, but I assign 50-50 out of symmetry. It doesn't feel the same, okay? So this was his motivation, which was really what I call a cognitive unease. It was not about the experiment. Later on, yes, he learned that Ellsberg ran this kind of thing. The Bayesian approach does not allow us to distinguish between these two 50-50s, right? So Keynes also wrote this. We have to assign 50-50 out of symmetry, but it doesn't feel the same. And then this was Ellsberg, and David developed this alternative theory, which opened up a whole field. I want to emphasize in the few minutes I have that the issue is both descriptive and normative, and this was very important to David. Okay. On the descriptive side, namely how people behave, okay, so people feel differently about it, and they can behave differently. And there have been applications of David Choquet expected utility to behavior in finance and questions like this, that when there's time of uncertainty, maybe there's less trade, and all kind of phenomena in finance that are much better explained by David's Choquet expected utility than by the standard one. But there's also the normative issue. And the normative issue, and I want to go back to the questions I had at the beginning, we have uncertainty about global warming. Is it the right thing to do to adopt a subjective prior? Okay? Our governments have to make decisions about these kind of things. Do I want the people in the government to adopt a subjective prior because this is the normative thing to do? So forget about these traders in the stock market. They're stupid. They're making all kind of mistakes. Okay, whatever. Okay. But is it the right thing to do? Do I want the government that represents me to assign some number to these kind of questions and make decisions based on that? And in Israel, we have other examples beyond global warming too, and some of them talk about. And here, I'll just give this example of arborites and cyclophines. So the claim is that not necessarily. And the example is that you walk down on campus and you see arborites and cyclophines. There is a talk this afternoon. And I'm asking you, do you think that arborites are a subset of cyclophines? Now, you never heard these terms before. That's the point, okay? I made them up. And I ask you, do you think that arborites are a subset of cyclophines? What's the probability, okay? And the idea is that we don't know, because I don't even know if arborites and cyclophines are, a billion groups or ancient languages or the enzymes. I have no idea what field of knowledge they come from. So some people are tempted to say, like Bayes did, 50-50. But 50-50 doesn't work, right? Because what about cyclophines being a subset of arborites? What about the two concepts being logically independent or the two disjoint? You can't assign 50-50 to everything, okay? And what we feel in our bones is that the right answer here is that we just don't know. It's not that I don't know 0.5 or don't know 0.55. I don't have the foggiest idea. And the Bayesian language doesn't have this in it. The Bayesian approach doesn't allow us in its language to say it's not about, I have no idea. Now, albudites and cyclophines are this frivolous example that we use somewhere just to make the point. The real question is not about albudites and cyclophines. The real questions are questions that we don't know about. For instance, what's the extent of global warming? Will the Iranians use the bomb once they have it? All kinds of questions that are quite relevant to our lives. They're not so abstract as the albudites and cyclophines, but they're also not Bors and Ernst. Now, 30 seconds, I'm fine. One problem with Ellsberg experiments are very beautiful, very nice to show the point and to show exactly what's the problem in Savage's axioms, but also very tempting to say the right approach is to be Bayesian, because with Ellsberg, if you want to be Bayesian, you know what prior to take. The 50-50 cries out loud, take me, take me. When it comes to the, whether it's uncertainty about global warming or about the Iranians using the bomb, we don't have a prior that's very natural. So even if we want to be Bayesian, we still don't know how. And this, I think, was one very important message of David's, and my time is up.